Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a nice evening. Thank you all for being here. I think most of you know who I am, Nick Mueller, the President and CEO of the National World War II Museum, and we're just delighted as we can be to have you all for this lecture in the Stage Door Canteen, our latest installment in the series of Meet the Author. Before we get going, I'd like to do what I always do and ask if we got any World War II veterans here. We have a World War II veteran in the room? I guess not. Do we have veterans from any war in the room? And if so, Alan Millett, I know, is back there. Raise your hand, and thank you all for your service. Well, I say every event that we have, Mason Lecture and Meet the Author series is special, but tonight's event is extra special for me because, on a personal level, because I'm about to introduce the speaker for this evening, who is a student of mine and Stephen Ambrose from back in the 70s, and he got his master's degree out at the LSUNO, now University of New Orleans, and he turned out okay. You know, he's got a master's degree, and so we did some things right, and he did some things right, and obviously he got good grades, and he got his master's degree, and he came on. And so our speaker is Dan Haulman. He is the chief of the Organizational History Division at the Air Force Historical Research Agency, where he's been working since 1982. So just goes to show you, historians can get good jobs and prosper and be successful in their lives. And I know you hear a lot of things about how hard it is to get jobs if you're in the liberal arts, but we'd like to put a plug in for historians and people who have degrees in the liberal arts, and I think they do quite well. Dan has authored 5 books in his career: Air Force Aerial Victory Credits, World War I, World War II, Korea and Vietnam. Also, the United States and Air Force and Humanitarian Airlift Operations from 47 to 94. Another book, 100 Years of Flight, U.S. Air Force Chronology of Significant Air and Space Events, 1903 to 2002. And lastly, and subject of this evening's presentation, the book, The Tuskegee Airmen and the Never Lost a Bomber Myth. And he'll be talking this evening about the Tuskegee Airmen in Illustrated History, 1939 to 49. At this point in the historiography of World War II, one might think that nearly every facet of the war has been written about many, many times, and there's nothing new or significant to say. Non-historians would never say something like that, I mean, non-historians would say something like that. Historians would never say something like that. But Dan himself has come up with some new things that add to the reservoir of knowledge and understanding about World War II. He's been doing a lot of intensive digging through the Air Force archives, and the careful work that he has conducted has resulted in a book that adds to the historical record and allows us to appreciate and respect even more those men that we call the Tuskegee Airmen. So I'm proud to introduce tonight a former student, a successful historian presenting on the Tuskegee Airmen and Illustrated History. Dan?
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you tonight about one of my favorite subjects. And first of all, let me say that even though I'll be talking about the Tuskegee Airmen in Illustrated History, 1939 to 1949, I'm not going to really claim all the credit for that book because I'm one of 3 authors of that book. Joseph Caver and Jerome Ennals are the other 2 authors. And if you look at a copy of the book, you'll see their pictures and you'll see that they contributed to the book as well as I did. So I'll be talking mostly about what I know about the book and what I know about the Tuskegee Airmen. But I want to make sure you remember that it wasn't just a solitary effort. It was a group effort. It was them as well as I. One reason I mentioned their names is because they work where I do at the Air Force Historical Research Agency. And you may wonder, what is somebody like me writing a book about the Tuskegee Airmen? Well, one of the reasons is because of where I work and where the other two authors work as well. We all work at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base. And that's really the repository of Air Force historical documents. During World War II, it was required of every unit to have a unit historian, and they would keep careful records of their activities. Different organizations of the Air Force were squadrons, groups, wings, numbered air forces, and so on. And so those records were stored in Washington, D.C. originally. And not only those records, but other records like mission reports, daily mission reports, and missing aircrew reports, and the orders that awarded aerial victory credits, and the orders that awarded distinguished flying crosses. All of these documents were stored in Washington. Back in 1949, the decision was made to move those documents, the Air Force archives, if you will, to Maxwell Air Force Base. And the reason they moved to Alabama was because Maxwell Air Force Base was also the home of the new Air University. General Fairchild, who was head of Air University at the time, wanted the documents at the Air University Library, the secondary sources, periodicals, books, to be supplemented by the primary source materials that are in this Air Force document collection. And if you want to go one place that has more documents about the history of the Army Air Forces in World War II and the history of the Air Force since then the place to come would be Maxwell Air Force Base, the Air Force Historical Research Agency. So I want to put a plug in for where I work, and one reason why this book is a little different from others. It's based more firmly than some publications on those historical documents. These are the names of the authors. You can see Jerome Ennals and Joseph Caver are the other two authors. Now, the significance of the Tuskegee Airmen, many people are familiar with the Tuskegee Airmen. Of course, they were the first black pilots in American military service. They were the only black pilots in American military service during World War II. They contributed, of course, to the desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces partly because of their success. The decision was made by the president just after the end of World War II to integrate the military services, not just the Air Force, but all the military services. And one reason why he made that decision was because of the record that units like the Tuskegee Airmen made. Now, there were other black units in World War II, but in the Army Air Forces, there was just a small handful of units. There were 8 squadrons of flyers, and there were 2 groups, and I want to talk about them a little bit later. One reason why the Tuskegee Airmen are famous is because the first general in the Air Force was a Tuskegee Airman, Benjamin Davis, Jr., and the first 4-star general in any of the military services was Chappy James, who was also a Tuskegee Airman. So the Tuskegee Airmen are famous in history for a number of things, and that's another aspect of their history. They proved that blacks could fly in combat as well as whites, and that was up in the air. And in the 1920s, the Army prepared a paper on black soldiers, and it was a very negative paper. It wasn't really based that much on objective research, and it cast doubt on whether black troops were the equal of white troops. And partly because of the record of the Tuskegee Airmen in World War II, that misconception was corrected. And again, they fought 2 wars, not just against the enemy overseas, but also against racism at home and racism within the American military services. In fact, the reason that it's sometimes called the Double V campaign in World War II is because it was a double victory, a victory against racism and a victory against fascism. There's a new documentary that Lucasfilm has just produced called Double Victory, and that's going to be televised this fall and early next year. Double Victory is already produced. It's a documentary about the Tuskegee Airmen, but there's another Lucasfilm that's coming out January 20th, 2012, called Red Tails. Now, that's not a documentary, but I'm sure it will focus a lot more people's attention on the Tuskegee Airmen and what they did in World War II. This book is a little different from others. As I mentioned, it's based more firmly than some on the actual documents of the Tuskegee Airmen in World War II. As I mentioned, those unit histories, the group histories, the 332nd Fighter Group histories, the 99th Fighter Squadron histories, the 477th Bombardment Group histories, their mission reports, the mission reports in combat, and the orders that awarded them various honors, such as aerial victory credits and distinguished flying crosses, and on missing aircrew reports. All these documents are available to the people that do research at the agency, and the three authors are all there. It doesn't only focus on the pilots. You know, a lot of times when you hear people talk about the Tuskegee Airmen, they're talking about the fighter pilots who were in combat, flying red-tail P-51s. Now, that's an important chapter in their history, but that's not the whole story of the Tuskegee Airmen. Some of them were not pilots at all. There were ground personnel supporting the pilots. Some of them were bomber pilots and not fighter pilots. Some of them were bombardiers and navigators working with those bomber pilots. And some of them were even working on the ground in the training part of the Tuskegee Airmen at Tuskegee in Alabama, at the 3 different airfields around Tuskegee, the only place where black pilots were allowed to train in the American military during World War II. So there's a lot of different reasons why this book is a little different from others. And it does correct some misconceptions that people have had. Sometimes with a legendary group like the Tuskegee Airmen, there's a misconception. Sometimes there are myths that have developed over the years, and those can be corrected if you look at the documentation. These are some Tuskegee Airmen statistics that are mentioned in the book. There were almost 1,000 fighter pilots who trained at Tuskegee in the various stages of training during World War II. But there were a lot more ground personnel. If you add up all the ground personnel, there were even in excess of 14,000, because there were a lot more ground personnel than there were pilots. They had a lot of people behind them. For the 15th Air Force, they flew a total of 311 missions, and we have every mission report, all 311 missions that they flew for the 15th Air Force. That's a sample of some of the statistics in the book. They flew a lot more missions for the 12th Air Force before they were assigned to the 15th Air Force. Of those 311 missions for the 15th Air Force, escorting heavy bombers for the most part, 179 were escort missions for those bombers. 179 out of the 311 missions for the 15th Air Force. And 172 of those bomber escort missions were without bomber losses. There were 7 missions, however, in which bombers under Tuskegee Airmen escort were shot down by enemy aircraft, which refutes one of the stories you often hear that they never lost a bomber. There were some cases where they did lose some bombers, but it was a low loss rate, especially compared with other groups. In fact, if you compare the number of bombers they lost with the average number of bombers lost by the other fighter groups, the average number for the others was 46. The number they lost was only 27, so it is an outstanding record. They scored 112 aerial victory credits, and I'm counting what the 99th Fighter Squadron scored with P-40 aircraft overseas before the 332nd Fighter Group deployed, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that when I talk about the units. But these are some of the statistics: 96 distinguished flying crosses. And the reason I have that up there is because if you have a copy of the book, you'll see a major part of that book is a chronology, a very detailed chronology. And I'm glad to say that I was able to contribute that. That's my main contribution to the book, besides some of the chapter introductions, is that chronology. And it includes all of the incidents for which each of those 96 distinguished flying crosses were awarded. It also includes every aerial victory credit scored by the Tuskegee Airmen, with the Tuskegee Airmen who scored those credits mentioned by name. So these are some of the statistics. You can see 4 Tuskegee Airmen each earned 3 aerial victory credits in one day, and 3 of them Each shot down 4 enemy aircraft. This is a picture, a photograph of the first graduating class from advanced flying training in March of 1942. Before March 1942, the Tuskegee Airmen unit, the only Tuskegee Airmen unit at the time for flying, was the 99th Pursuit Squadron, which was redesignated soon the 99th Fighter Squadron. And it didn't have any pilots at first. When it was first started, it was intended to have pilots, but they needed to train the pilots. And the pilots underwent their training at Tuskegee, in the vicinity of Tuskegee. In this picture, there are some very significant persons. The man on the top left is Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who is the most famous Tuskegee Airman of all. Not only was he in the first graduating class of the pilots who graduated from Tuskegee Army Airfield, he was also a West Point graduate. He was the most famous leader of the 99th Fighter Squadron overseas. He came back to get the 332nd Fighter Group when it deployed overseas. He was the commander of the 332nd Fighter Group. And later on, he came back home to be the commander of the 477th Bombardment Group. So he was the commander of all the major Tuskegee Airmen organizations. Another famous Tuskegee Airman in this first graduating class is George Roberts up here. And you might have heard Robin Roberts on television. It's not the same Roberts that was her father. Her father is a Tuskegee Airman, but it's a different Roberts. This is George Spanky Roberts, who was one of the most famous Tuskegee Airmen. And one reason I mention him is because not only was he in that first graduating class, but he was the first black commander of the 99th Fighter Squadron, even before Benjamin O. Davis. They went through several phases of flying training. The first, of course, was civilian pilot training, where they learned how to fly an aircraft. Using Piper Cubs, they started at Kennedy Field in the area of Tuskegee, which was just a grassy field near Tuskegee Institute. And after they graduated from that part of the training, they moved to another field called Moton Field, where they conducted their primary training in biplanes, planes like you would see in World War I with the two wings. BT-13 and BT-17 biplanes, also some monoplanes called PT-19s. And after they received their primary training at Moton Field, then they moved to a third field, Tuskegee Army Airfield. If you go to Tuskegee Army Airfield today, you won't see much. You'll see a fence, you'll see a gate that says this is where Tuskegee Army Airfield was, but it's not the location of the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. That's at Moton Field. A lot of people who visit Moton Field visit the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. They think this is where everything happened. It's really where the primary training happened. The basic and advanced and transition training and more advanced aircraft actually took place at Tuskegee Army Airfield. And that was with BT-13 aircraft and then AT-6 trainer aircraft and then P-40s. I'm sure you've heard of the Flying Tigers in Asia during World War II. The Flying Tigers flew P-40s, and the Tuskegee Airmen trained in P-40s at Tuskegee. In fact, the 99th Fighter Squadron flew P-40s overseas. This is Class 45A. You can see the number of graduates increased. There were a total of 44 classes of pilots who graduated from Tuskegee, and there were almost 1,000 pilots who went through the training there. I'm not going to name all of them. Tuskegee Army Airfield, as I mentioned, was near Tuskegee. It wasn't the only field in the area that trained pilots, but it was the most important field because it was the largest, because it did the basic, advanced, and transition training. It had more runways than the other fields. It had 4 runways. It also was owned entirely by the Army Air Forces. It wasn't contracted out like Moton Field and Kennedy Field, which were really owned by Tuskegee Institute. And it was the commander at Tuskegee Army Airfield was a very famous man, Noel Parrish. Noel Parrish was a popular commander, even though he was a white man. He was in charge of the training at Tuskegee Army Airfield, and many of the Tuskegee Airmen, original Tuskegee Airmen, remember him fondly because he was one of those who encouraged their training, encouraged their success. In fact, I've been fortunate enough to have attended the past 5 Tuskegee Airmen National Conventions in a row. And I've got to meet a lot of the original Tuskegee Airmen, not only at those conventions, but also when they come to Air University at Maxwell Air Force Base to speak, or when they come do research at the agency. And they remember Noel Parrish, and there's even an award they present at the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated conventions in honor of Noel Parrish, because they remember what he did at Tuskegee Army Airfield. This is an aerial view on the left of Tuskegee Army Airfield at the end of World War II. You can see it was a fairly large base with 4 runways. It looks like it compares favorably with other Army Air Force training bases in World War II. On the right side, you'll see a satellite view of what it looks like today. There's not much left. I know the owners of this land, and they were trying to get that field to be the site of the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. But for many reasons, they decided to use Moton Field. It was more developed. It was closer to the interstate. It was closer to the other national park sites in Tuskegee. So there's several reasons it wasn't chosen. If you wonder why one of the runways was preserved and the others were not, after World War II, they used one of the runways as a drag racing strip. This is a picture of Colonel Noel Parrish, the commander at Tuskegee Army Airfield, and he did his utmost to ensure the success of the Tuskegee Airmen who trained at Tuskegee Army Airfield. He kept up with them after they left Tuskegee Army Airfield and deployed to combat, and he was encouraging of the integration of the Air Force after the Air Force did begin integration with Truman's executive order in 1948. The 99th Pursuit Squadron was the first black flying unit. It started out as the Pursuit Squadron. It later became the 99th Fighter Squadron. And it was the first to deploy overseas. In the spring of 1943, it deployed to North Africa, deployed to Tunisia. And it started flying patrol missions with P-40s. Some of its attacks were against ground targets, for example, the island of Pantelleria, which is between Sicily and North Africa, and also in Sicily. And after several patrol missions over Allied shipping in the Mediterranean, and also in support of Allied ground forces on the islands between Italy and North Africa, they moved to Italy. They moved to Sicily, and then they moved to Italy. And they continued flying for the 12th Air Force using those P-40 aircraft. Sometimes people forget about that chapter in Tuskegee Airmen history. A lot of the missions, the combat missions flown by the Tuskegee Airmen, were in P-40s before they had red-tail P-51s. You might have heard of a man named Charles Dryden, one of the most famous Tuskegee Airmen, wrote a book called A-Train. But Charles Dryden was a Tuskegee Airman, one of the most famous, but he never did fly a P-51 because he came home before the 332nd Fighter Group even deployed overseas, and the 332nd Fighter Group is the one that got the P-51s. The 99th Fighter Squadron was attached to various groups before the 332nd Fighter Group, which was a black group, was over there. And so the 99th was attached to various white fighter groups, and it had more success with some of those groups than with other groups. There was one commander of one of those groups who was critical of the way the 99th Fighter Squadron was flying in combat. He questioned whether they were doing as well as the other P-40 squadrons. And he actually wrote a letter, a memo, that went up the chain all the way to the head of the Army Air Forces, Hap Arnold, and there was even consideration of pulling the 99th Fighter Squadron out of combat. What the War Department decided to do, fortunately, was to launch a study to compare the 99th Fighter Squadron with the other P-40 squadrons in the theater. And after that study was released in early 1945, it was determined that the 99th was flying just as well as the other P-40 units. There was no reason to question their efforts and their abilities. The 332nd Fighter Group is the best known of the Tuskegee Airmen organizations. It originally embraced 3 squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons. It trained for combat overseas while the 99th Fighter Squadron was over in Italy, flying its combat missions. The 332nd Fighter Group was in Michigan, training to go overseas. It started in Tuskegee and moved to Selfridge Field, Michigan. The 332nd Fighter Group ultimately deployed to Italy and flew for the 12th Air Force. But the 99th Fighter Squadron wasn't originally assigned to the 332nd. So there was a black squadron flying with white groups, and then the other 3 black squadrons in the 332nd Fighter Group were flying for the same Air Force in different aircraft, in P-39 aircraft. So 3 of the squadrons were flying P-39 aircraft, 1 of them was flying P-40 aircraft, but the same kinds of missions, supporting ground troops, protecting ground troops against enemy aircraft. They weren't escorting bombers yet. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, as I mentioned, was the commander of the 99th in combat overseas for many months before he came back to command the 332nd and take it overseas and be commander of it. This is a very famous picture. Of all the pictures of the Tuskegee Airmen, I think this is one of my favorites. And it's because the man on the left is Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the man on the right is Benjamin O. Davis, Sr. The man on the left was the first, eventually became the first black general in the Air Force. The man on the right, his father, was the first black general in the Army. This picture was taken in September of 1944, and it shows the elder Benjamin O. Davis pinning the Distinguished Flying Cross on his son. And it was for a mission that his son had flown on June 9th, 1944. So it's a very important occasion. There were other Tuskegee Airmen at the same event that were also getting Distinguished Flying Crosses, and that's who they are in the background. June 1944 was a crucial month because that's when the 332nd Fighter Group received the new mission to escort bombers, heavy bombers, of the 15th Air Force. Remember, it had been serving the 12th Air Force, flying those tactical missions in support of ground troops. In June of 1944, it got a new mission, was transferred to the 15th Air Force, began flying P-47 aircraft for a long-range bomber escort, escorting B-24s and B-17s on long-range missions, some of them all the way into Germany. And they had to use P-47 aircraft because the P-47s had longer range. And they also were better at dogfighting than the P-39s. The P-39s were never really designed for air-to-air combat. They were based at Ramatelli Airfield in Italy, and they remained in Ramatelli for the rest of the war. This is a map. It's hard to see that it's part of Italy, but imagine the eastern side of Italy on the Adriatic Sea. You see the Adriatic Sea on the right, and you'll see that there are a lot of different locations there. There were 21 different bombardment groups in the 15th Air Force, B-17 groups, B-24 groups in various wings. There were only 7 fighter groups to escort them. So if you just think about it, for every 3 bombardment groups, there was only 1 fighter group. There were 3 bombardment groups for every fighter group. So there were a lot more bombers than there were fighters to escort them. And they were located all in the same vicinity of eastern Italy. These are some of the bombers that they escorted, the B-17 on the left and the B-24 on the right. There's not a lot of difference in size and the amount of bombs they carried. The B-24 could fly a little bit faster, a little bit farther. The B-17 could fly higher and was a lot more survivable if it were hit. But these are the 2 most famous bombers in the European theater during World War II. And incidentally, before I get off the slide, I should mention, partly for some of my family members, my cousins and my aunt, my uncle was a B-17 ball turret gunner in World War II. So he served in that kind of plane, the B-17. My father was a B-24 bomber pilot in World War II, and he served in this kind of plane. They were in the 8th Air Force. They weren't in the 15th Air Force, so they weren't escorted by Tuskegee Airmen, but they were escorted by fighters. And those bomber crews really appreciated the escort they got from the fighter groups. July 1944 was also a very important month for the Tuskegee Airmen because during that month, the 99th Fighter Squadron, which was physically located somewhere else, came to Ramitelli and started serving with the 332nd. So the 332nd Fighter Group was the only fighter group in the World War II in combat that had 4 squadrons assigned to it. Not only the 100th, 301st, and 302nd that it originally had, but the 99th was assigned to it too. And the 99th got that bomber escort mission like the other squadrons in July of 1944. The P-51 aircraft was also flown for the first time by the 332nd Fighter Group in July of 1944. The P-47 was a good plane, but it wasn't as fast, and it didn't have the range of a P-47. The P-51 had a longer range and was faster. It was a better aircraft to be used for flying escort missions. I was talking to one of the original Tuskegee Airmen about the P-47 and the P-51. He had flown both kinds of aircraft. And I said, which aircraft did you prefer? And he said, well, actually, I knew the P-51 was faster, and I knew the P-51 could go farther, but I actually liked the P-47. And I said, well, why did you like the P-47? He said, because it had a big air-cooled engine in the front, and it protected me against enemy bullets. The P-51 had a water-cooled engine, and if it were hit by enemy bullets, it was not as survivable as the P-47. But anyway, the P-51s were the ones that were painted with red tails, and you often hear people talk about how did they get red tails. Well, all of the fighter groups that served with the 15th Air Force had their own color, their own tail scheme, and that was to tell them apart for these long-range missions. The formations had to tell which group was which. And so the 332nd Fighter Group had red tails, solid red tails. The 31st Fighter Group had striped red tails. The 52nd Fighter Group had yellow tails. And the 325th Fighter Group had black and yellow checkered tails. So all of them had tails painted a certain color, a certain scheme. But often you'll hear the Tuskegee Airmen called red tails, as they are in the Lucasfilm movie, because that was what distinguished their aircraft from the others. This is a picture of some of the Tuskegee Airmen at Ramitelli in August of 1944, and that's a P-51 aircraft behind them. You can see, not very well, but there's a fuel tank there behind them. The wings had huge fuel tanks to enable them to go those long-range missions all the way deep into Germany. Some of them at first had 75 gallons. Some of them later had 150 gallons. One mission they flew later on, they needed the 150-gallon tanks to go all the way to Berlin, and I'll talk about that mission in a little while. The 332nd Fighter Group Bomber Escort mission, I've already mentioned something about that. They flew 179 bomber escort missions during World War II for the 15th Air Force, the heavy bomber escorts. And they lost bombers on only 7 of those 179 missions. In other words, 172 missions, they didn't lose bombers. And there were 27 bombers shot down altogether while they were under Tuskegee Airmen escort. But the other groups lost an average of more bombers than the 332nd did. This could be one of the reasons why that statement, that claim, they never lost a bomber, started. It wasn't the Tuskegee Airmen themselves that started it. It was in the press. I noticed 2 articles in March of 1945. One of them was an article by Roy Otley in Liberty Magazine, March 10th, 1945, where he claimed that the Tuskegee Airmen, he didn't call them Tuskegee Airmen, they weren't really called that yet, but he said the Red-Tailed Angels, the 332nd Fighter Group, had not lost a bomber in 100 missions. Now, technically that was true because they had flown over 130 missions by then. But they lost bombers in the first several missions. And so they didn't fly 100 missions before they lost any bombers. They did fly over 100 missions without losing bombers, but they lost bombers on 6 of the missions in the summer of 1944. So it wouldn't be really logical to say that just because they didn't lose them in 100 missions that they never lost them, period. 2 weeks later, another article appeared in the Chicago Defender, this article, and it said the 332nd flies its 200th mission without loss. Well, that reporter must have seen what the other reporter came up with, and he knew that by the end of February 1945, that the 332nd Fighter Group had flown 200 missions for the 15th Air Force. So he jumped to the conclusion that since they flew 200 missions, he thought they had not lost a bomber in 100 missions, and 2 weeks later he was saying they didn't lose a bomber in 200 missions. Later on, that became they didn't lose a bomber, period. So it wasn't ever true. Let me tell you one reason why I think the statement started circulating, and the reason the reporters might have gotten the wrong idea, is because from my research, between August 24th, 1944, and March 24th, 1945, they had gone 7 months without losing a bomber. And there were several Tuskegee Airmen who deployed overseas during that 7-month period. They didn't remember losing any bombers. The bombers had been lost on 6 missions in the summer of 1944. And then on a 7th mission in March 24th, 1945, there were more bombers shot down. So there were a total of 7 missions where Tuskegee Airmen escorted bombers were shot down. But for the most part, most of the missions, the bombers were protected and there were no bombers lost for 172 out of 179 of those missions. The 24th March 1945 mission was the most famous mission of the Tuskegee Airmen because it was the only one that went all the way to Berlin. It was the only 15th Air Force mission to Berlin, and you might wonder, why didn't the 15th Air Force fly missions to Berlin before that? Well, the reason is because the 8th Air Force was doing that. The 8th Air Force based in England. They didn't need to fly missions from Italy to Berlin because the 8th Air Force was already doing that quite well. The reason why the 15th Air Force got the job on the 24th of March 1945 is because that was the day the Allies, some of the Allies, the Americans, were crossing the Rhine River in Germany. And the 8th Air Force needed its aircraft to support that crossing of the Rhine. So the mission that day was given to the 15th Air Force. The 332nd Fighter Group was one of 5 fighter groups to escort the bombers of the 5th Wing, B-17s, all the way to Berlin. It was the longest mission the 15th Air Force flew, the longest mission the Tuskegee Airmen ever flew, and it's noted for another reason. It's the first time the Tuskegee Airmen shot down jets. There were 3 Tuskegee Airmen who each shot down a German jet that day. Now, the German jets, the Me-262s, had an average speed of 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51s. Even though the P-51s were fast planes, the best Allied aircraft, fighter aircraft in World War II, they weren't nearly as fast as the German planes. So for a P-51 to shoot down an Me-262 was quite a feat. Now, sometimes you might hear that they were the Tuskegee Airmen were the first fighter pilots to shoot down German jets, but that's not true. There were other American fighter pilots who did shoot down German jets before that. One reason I mention this is because those 3 pilots who shot down German jets that day, I know one of them personally because I got to meet him at the Tuskegee Airmen conventions. He came to the agency, to the Air Force Historical Research Agency, to do research. And his name is Roscoe Brown, and because of our personal friendship, I asked him if he would write the foreword to this book. And he happily agreed to do that. So if you look at the book, you'll see the foreword is written by an original Tuskegee Airman who shot down a German jet. Roscoe Brown is still living, and he's still being interviewed different places. But he's getting pretty old now. I think he's 92 years old. Most of the Tuskegee Airmen, as I said, are in their upper 80s and early 90s. The 332nd Fighter Group received its only distinguished unit citation for this mission, though the 99th Fighter Squadron, before it was assigned to the 332nd, had already earned 2 of those distinguished unit citations. aerial victory credits of the Tuskegee Airmen is how I got interested in the subject to begin with. I worked at the Air Force Historical Research Agency. I knew we had the histories of groups like the 332nd and squadrons like the 99th, but I wasn't really focusing on the Tuskegee Airmen until I decided to do a paper on the aerial victory credits of the Tuskegee Airmen, focusing on the 99th Fighter Squadron and the 332nd Fighter Group and the other fighter squadrons assigned to it. And they shot down 112 aircraft during World War II. Every one of these aircraft aerial victories had to be documented. If you were a pilot in World War II and you shot down an enemy aircraft, you could fill out a claim statement, but you wouldn't get credit automatically for shooting down that plane. You had to have evidence from witness statements from others that saw you do it or gun camera film. There was a victory credit board that met in every theater, and they considered this evidence, the claim statement, the witness statements, and the gun camera film. And putting all that together, the victory credit boards decided who got credit for which aircraft, on what days. And they documented that with an order. Every one of the aerial victory credits awarded to the Tuskegee Airmen is mentioned in the chronology of the book on the day the victory occurred. And so there were a lot of 12th Air Force and 15th Air Force orders that I had to look up to confirm all that. 3 of the Tuskegee Airmen shot down 4 enemy aircraft, but none of the Tuskegee Airmen became aces. An ace is a pilot who shot down 5 enemy aircraft. Sometimes you hear that Lee Archer was the only black ace in World War II, or the only Tuskegee Airman ace. And Lee Archer is one of those, although he is no longer living, I got to meet him several times, several times at different places, in Montgomery and Birmingham and at the Tuskegee Airmen national conventions that I attended before he died. And he knew that there was documentation for the 4 aerial victory credits he claimed. He claimed 4, and he received credit for all 4. But he was not the only Tuskegee Airman who got 4 aerial victories. There were 2 others. One reason why there were no Tuskegee Airmen aces is because the 99th Fighter Squadron deployed so much later than other fighter squadrons, and the 332nd Fighter Group didn't actually deploy until 1944, didn't reach Italy until 1944. So one reason why there were no aces is because they weren't over there as long as a lot of the other groups and squadrons that had been over there for a longer time. Another thing to think about, too, is the number of enemy aircraft that rose to challenge the bombers had declined somewhat over those years. The 477th Bombardment Group is sometimes ignored. If you think about the Tuskegee Airmen being fighter pilots, even fighter pilots who not only escorted bombers but did other things, you still miss part of the story because the 477th Bombardment Group was the only black bombardment group in World War II. The reason they don't get as much attention is partly because they didn't deploy overseas. They stayed within the United States preparing for combat. There were 4 squadrons, the 616th, 617th, 618th, 619th. They practiced in B-25 aircraft. One reason why it took them longer to train is because they didn't only have a pilot in the plane. They also had a 5-man crew, which included a bombardier and a navigator. So it took longer to train them to begin with. Also, they didn't begin their training until 1944. When the 332nd Fighter Group deployed overseas at the beginning of 1944, the 477th Bombardment Group was activated. So it had a much later start than other bombardment groups in World War II. So it never really had a chance to deploy. Now sometimes, and there's some truth to this charge, people might say the 477th didn't get a chance to deploy overseas partly because it kept being moved from base to base. And there's evidence that, well, yes, it was moved several times from base to base. One of those moves is especially important in the history of the Tuskegee Airmen. When the 477th Bombardment Group, which was originally at Selfridge and later at Godman Field, when it moved to Freeman Field, there was a larger airfield to work with. The Tuskegee Airmen and all the people helping train the 477th were glad that they moved to Freeman Field because it was a much larger field. It was a blessing, but it was a curse as well, because the commander of the 477th Fighter Group decided that the base was big enough not only for more bombers, not only for more runways and more training, but big enough for 2 officers' clubs. And he set up one of the officers' clubs for trainers and one for trainees. And it was really a thinly disguised excuse to have an officers' club for white officers and an officers' club for black officers. So it was really trying to segregate the officers' clubs at Freeman Field, even though there was an Army regulation that said if you're an officer on a base, you can go to the officers' club. You can belong to the officers' club. No reference to race. Partly because of the commander of the 477th Bombardment Group requiring separate officers' clubs, some of the Tuskegee Airmen, the 477th Bombardment Group members, resisted that policy. And 101 of them were arrested for not signing a statement saying they go along with the policy. They didn't want segregated officers' clubs. They wanted the ability to go to any officers' club that was at Freeman Field. Eventually, the Army Air Forces exonerated all 101 of those pilots because it knew that it couldn't defy its own regulations. The order of the commander of the 477th did not have more weight than the Army regulations that allowed officers, regardless of color, to be members of the officers' club. But that episode in Tuskegee Airmen history is called the Freeman Field Mutiny, and it contributed to the integration of the Army Air Forces, at least the officers' clubs, at some of the Army Air Forces bases, and also ultimately contributed to the integration of the American military forces and American society at large. When Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. finished commanding the 332nd Fighter Group in combat overseas, he came back to be the commander of the 477th Bombardment Group. So he was commander of the 99th, then the 332nd, then the 477th. So he's definitely the most famous of all the Tuskegee Airmen. After World War II, the 332nd Fighter Group was inactivated. The 477th Bombardment Group became the 477th Composite Group because the 99th was assigned to it. It wasn't a bombardment group only because it had fighters assigned to it as well as bombers, so it became a composite group. And then later on, the 477th was inactivated just after World War II, and the 332nd Fighter Group was activated again at the same base at Lockbourne in Ohio. And the 332nd Fighter Group entered a competition in 1949, just before it was inactivated finally. And that was a gunnery meet in Las Vegas, where it won the Propeller Aircraft Division. They had jet aircraft at that time, so they had 2 divisions, a Propeller Aircraft Division and a Jet Aircraft Division. And the winner of the Propeller Aircraft Division was the 332nd Fighter Group. And ironically, that honor was just before the 332nd Fighter Group was inactivated. The reason the 332nd Fighter Group was inactivated in 1949 was because President Truman had made the decision in 1948 in an executive order to integrate the armed forces. The armed forces didn't immediately get integrated when that executive order was issued. There had to be some time for the Army, the Navy, and eventually the Air Force to implement that new policy. And they did implement, the Air Force implemented it in 1949 with the inactivation of the only combat group, black combat group in the Air Force, and that was the 332nd at the time. So the members of the 332nd were assigned to other organizations which became integrated. Some of the Tuskegee Airmen became famous. As I mentioned, Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. became the first general, black general in the Air Force. Chappy James became the first 4-star black general, not only in the Air Force, but in the American military. Charles McGee, another Tuskegee Airman I've had the chance to meet and know pretty well, served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He flew more missions than any other Air Force pilot, 409 combat missions. President Harry Truman, as I said, issued Executive Order 9981, which integrated the military services, or at least put into motion the integration of the American military services. And the Tuskegee Airmen contributed to that decision because of their record in World War II. This is a picture of Daniel Chappy James, the first black four-star general. And I'm getting near the end of my time, but I did want to mention something about him. When he started out, he was in the 477th Bombardment Group. And you may wonder, just look at the picture and wonder, why wasn't he a fighter pilot in World War II? Why was he a bomber pilot? Right, he was too big for the cockpit. He was a big guy. He was over 6 feet tall. And so they didn't want to put him in one of these small fighter cockpits. By the time of the Korean War, he was the fighter aircraft had gotten bigger. They could hold bigger pilots. And so he flew fighters in Korea. He flew fighters in Vietnam. And so he was not only a bomber pilot for the Tuskegee Airmen in World War II, but he was a fighter pilot in the Air Force in Korea and Vietnam. And again, he was important as a four-star general in the American military. In conclusion, let me remind you that if you want to do research on the Tuskegee Airmen, one of the best places to come would be the Air Force Historical Research Agency, or you could contact us and we could send you some information electronically. But we have a lot of the documentation, the primary source documentation for the Tuskegee Airmen, the 332nd Fighter Group, 477th Bombardment Group, and their organizations. I'd like to open up the floor now for questions. If anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them.
If you have questions, please raise your hand and I'll come to you.
Just curious where Freeman Field was.
Freeman Field was, I believe it was in Illinois. No, Indiana. I'm sorry, Indiana. Some people think that it was in the South because of the policy, the segregation policy. But actually, it was in the North. It was in Indiana. Godman Field was in Kentucky. So they moved actually further north, and that was where they had the segregation issue with Freeman Field. But it was in Indiana. Another question?
Yes. I was in Korea at K-13, and was a fighter interceptor wing and a fighter bomber wing. And there was a Davis who came on board as the commander of the fighter interceptor wing, and I was wondering if that was the son of the guy that was being decorated by his father.
It probably was Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., because he stayed in the service, and at the end of World War II, he rose up to be a general, but he was a colonel at the end of World War II.
We're talking about 1954.
Yes, it's probably the same Benjamin O. Davis.
Yeah. There was a little revolution went over there, and they said that they weren't going to fly for this black guy.
Really?
And he took care of it in 2 days. Everybody was flying.
He was very well respected. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., by the way, had gone to West Point. And a lot of people don't realize this. You know, I mentioned the Freeman Field mutiny, and I mentioned the guy who was commander of the 477th who tried to segregate the officers' clubs. And he's gone down in history as a villain because of that. But not many people realize he had also been the commander of the 332nd Fighter Group before Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. was. He helped prepare it to go overseas in 1943. So Robert Selway, who was the commander of the 477th, had been commander of the 332nd. If something had happened to him and he had never been the 477th Bombardment Group commander, he probably would have gone down in history as one of the heroes of the Tuskegee Airmen because he helped train the 332nd Fighter Group to go overseas. The reason I mentioned that is because Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. and Robert Selway had more in common than being commander of both of the groups, the black groups during World War II. They also were both West Point graduates. And when Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. was at West Point, he had to endure a lot of abuse because he was the only black officer at West Point at the time. He wasn't the first black officer at West Point, but he was the only black officer there at the time. And he was ostracized by the other officers. They didn't speak with him except when it was official business. They talked to him what they had to on official business, but he didn't have a roommate. He had to eat by himself and so on, and because of the inherent racism of the time. Other questions?
wondering what is the reason or reasons for the success of the 172 of 179 missions without anyone being shot down?
Well, I think that's a good question. Sometimes historians have looked into that, and they've wondered why they had seemed to have more success at protecting bombers than some of the other groups. And I think one of the reasons was because Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was very intent on fulfilling the command of the head of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, who was Ira Eaker. Some of you are familiar with World War II history. Ira Eaker was the original commander of the 8th Air Force. He was moved to the Mediterranean theater against his will. He wanted to stay the commander of the 8th Air Force. But when he moved to the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, he brought the same policies he had established at the 8th Air Force, and that was to have the fighter escorts stick with the bombers. And that was a policy that he enforced in the 8th Air Force before he left England, and in the 15th Air Force that was under the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces in the Mediterranean and in Italy. Some of the other groups didn't follow that policy as much. As the war went on, commanders like Jimmy Doolittle, I'm sure you've heard of Jimmy Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force after Eaker, he set up a new policy. In fact, there's a famous incident. When he became the commander of the 8th Air Force in England, he walked into a room and he saw a sign in General Kepner's office. Kepner was the head of the 8th Fighter Command. And the sign said, the first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers home safely. He looked at that sign and he said, who put that up? And Kepner said, well, that's the policy that's been established, and it was really Eaker's policy. He said, take that sign down. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to shoot down enemy aircraft. And so a lot of the fighters followed that policy. Fighter groups followed that policy. They were more interested in shooting down enemy aircraft than they were in sticking with the bombers. I think there's some evidence that Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was trying to enforce the original policy of sticking with the bombers, even though that policy had eroded a little bit over the years. But that might be one reason.
Elaborate upon that thing you just mentioned, the movie about the Tuskegee Airmen. It was out 10 or more years ago.
Oh, the HBO movie,
Lawrence
yes.
Fishburne, Malcolm Jamal
Yes,
Warner, etc. And they did point that out. The reason they were successful and they lost so few bombers is they stayed with the bombers.
Right, and that was the policy of the 8th Air Force before Eaker left. It was the policy in the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces when Eaker came to the theater. But Eaker didn't enforce it as much in the Mediterranean theater as he had in the 8th Air Force, because there were more fighters, and sometimes he even let the 332nd Fighter Group and Benjamin O. Davis Jr., if you look at the mission reports of the 332nd Fighter Group, sometimes they would go out on fighter sweeps. Sometimes part of the group would stick with the bombers and part of the group would go after enemy fighters. So there was some of both. Other questions? Yes.
One last question, just a minute, ma'am.
If we went to Indiana, would we be able to see the original air base today?
Freeman Field? I'm not really sure. There's a series of books about Air Force bases and Army Air Force bases in World War II. It's called Forgotten Fields. And I've got the volume about Tuskegee Army Airfield, but I don't have the volume for Freeman Field. Most of those bases are long since gone, and they've been developed into other things. Some of them are in ruin. Some of them have been developed into industrial parks. Some of them have become private airports. But I'm not really sure what happened to Freeman Field or what it is used for today. I wish I could tell you, but I don't know.
Thank you, Dr. Haulman.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for a very enlightening program. If my old professorial role, it would have been A++, high honors, honoris causa, and just outstanding and enlightening. I think everybody gained new appreciation and insights to the Tuskegee Airmen, and we very much appreciate your remarks. in the context of your remarks and the subject of tonight's presentation, I can make an announcement that Dan knows a little bit something about, but doesn't know the exact news is going to be. But he knows that I've been talking to him for some time about acquiring a P-51 for the new United States Freedom Pavilion, the Boeing Center. And just last week, one of our trustees from Chicago, who's been helping me raise the money in the quest to acquire a P-51, told me last week that he had secured or made a commitment for $500,000 to enable us to get one restored out in California. And it will go in the U.S. Freedom Pavilion, not in time for our opening, but about 6 months later, and we're going to, the markings on it will be the red tails. At least that plane, that P-51, is going to help us carry the story of the Tuskegee Airmen forward here in the National World War II Museum. In just a moment, Dan is going to be signing copies of his book outside in the atrium out here, so I hope all of you who haven't got a copy yet will get one. And I also want to mention before we adjourn to let you all know about our international conference on World War II that we're hosting December 7th through 9. We're going to have scholars from around the country and around the world traveling to New Orleans, veterans as well. A couple of the Doolittle Raiders will be with us, veteran of Guadalcanal. A 2.5-day conference extraordinaire. So I want to encourage all of you to join into that event. We're already signing people up. Unlike our lectures, however, its space is limited, and it's a conference that requires a fee. But we really do have an extraordinary conference assembled on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And the conference will not just focus on Pearl Harbor itself. That will be part of the opening sessions, the evening of December 7th and the next day and following. But we're going to actually carry the conference story all the way through most of 42 in the Pacific, through that period of attack, tremendous fear and panic in our own country as everyone began to realize that we were now at war with not only Japan but with Germany as well, and the tremendous outpouring of volunteers and the draft and raising an Army and Air Force and Navy and Coast Guard and Merchant Marine all flooded to the flag. So this conference will talk about America's feeling of being under siege in 41, into 41, and then moving into 42 as we begin to assemble our forces for counterattacks in Midway and ultimately going through Guadalcanal and the beginning of really stopping the Japanese invasions of the islands of the South Pacific. Actually, every year we're going to do a 70th anniversary conference of that year of the war. The following December or November will be on 42, and we'll look at the Mediterranean campaign in 42 and 43. So encourage you all to sign up and to join those that will be here. We have plenty of out-of-towners who are traveling across the country because of our distinguished lineup, and we do have conference brochures located here. You can pick one up as you leave, or you can register online or take the sign-up sheet that's in the brochure. But once again, I want to thank our guest speaker. As I said, it was a special pleasure for me to welcome Dan Haulman here, and I hope it's not going to be your last time, Dan, to come down this way. You're not too far away for a wonderful presentation. So join me in thanking him again, and go out and get a copy of his book.